I've cleaned every corner of this school, except one room I'm not allowed in. That's not an exaggeration. I've worked night shifts in schools for years. Elementary schools, middle schools, even a college campus for a while. After enough time, you learn every building has its quirks. Strange noises in old pipes, motion sensors that trigger for no reason, doors that stick during humid weather. There's always an explanation. At least there usually is. Every evening, I arrive about 30 minutes before my shift officially starts. The school is still alive then. Teachers finish grading papers, students linger near the exits, and the hallways echo with the last scraps of conversation before the building settles into silence. That's when I pass room 214. The door itself looks completely ordinary. Plain wood. No window. No sign. Nothing special. Yet somehow it stands out more than any decorated classroom in the building. Maybe it's because it's always locked. And I mean always. I've seen classrooms unlocked during lunch breaks, after school events, teacher meetings, and summer cleaning. I've seen storage rooms left open by accident and offices forgotten overnight. Never room 214. Not once. The lock catches my attention every time I walk by. Everything else in the hallway shows its age. Scratches cover the walls. Paint peels near the baseboards. Most of the classroom handles are dull from years of use. But the lock on room 214 looks brand new. The metal shines under the fluorescent lights. The handle is spotless. Not worn. Not faded. As if someone polishes it regularly. As if someone cares more about that door than any other part of the school. The strange thing is nobody talks about it. I asked the teacher once. She changed the subject. I asked another. He laughed and said he didn't know. Neither answer felt genuine. After a while, I stopped asking. Still, every night when I walk past that door, I feel myself slowing down. Looking. Wondering. What could possibly be inside a classroom that requires that much attention? Why keep it locked during school hours? Why maintain it so carefully when the rest of the building is slowly falling apart? The school feels completely normal everywhere else. That door is the only exception. And over time, I started realizing it wasn't the only strange thing about this place. Because the longer I worked there, the more stories I heard about the school's history and the things that supposedly happened within its walls. Cleaning schools at night sounds boring until you notice the patterns. Most people imagine the job as hours of pushing a mop through empty hallways and collecting trash. To be fair, that's a big part of it. My nights usually followed the same routine. Clock in, check supplies, empty the cafeteria bins before they started smelling like a science experiment, sweep the hallways, clean classrooms, repeat until sunrise. It was predictable. And predictable is something you learn to appreciate when you work alone in a building the size of a small town. The school changed completely after dark. During the day, every hallway was packed with noise, teachers giving instructions, students shouting across rooms, phones ringing in the office. By midnight, all of that disappeared. The silence became its own kind of atmosphere. At first, it bothered me. Every creak sounded important. Every distant thump made me stop what I was doing. But after enough years, you develop a sense for normal nighttime noises. Old buildings settle. Air vents groan. Pipes knock behind walls. Sometimes a loose sign rattles because the heating system kicks on. You hear enough strange sounds and eventually stop caring. I like joking that ghosts would have to schedule an appointment if they wanted my attention. Most nights, the biggest threat was finding a forgotten lunch rotting inside a student's locker. Still, there were moments that made even me pause. A shadow at the end of a hallway. A classroom door that seemed open when you could have sworn it was closed earlier. The feeling that someone had just walked past a corner moments before you arrived. Nothing concrete. Nothing I couldn't explain away. The human brain doesn't like empty spaces. Give it enough darkness and silence, and it starts inventing company. That's what I always told myself. What made this school different wasn't the occasional strange noise. It was the people. Over the years, I met several janitors who had worked there before me. Most stayed only a few months. Some transferred. Others quit without much warning. That isn't unusual in maintenance work. The hours are rough, and the pay rarely matches the effort. But there was something odd about the way former employees talked about the building. Or rather, the way they avoided talking about certain parts of it. One retired custodian came back for a holiday event during my first year. We chatted for a while near the gymnasium. Everything was normal until I casually mentioned the second floor. His smile faded, just for a second. Then he asked whether room 214 was still locked. When I said yes, he nodded slowly. "Good," he replied. That was all. No explanation. No joke. Just one word. Good. Another janitor refused to clean that hallway during overtime shifts. He always found an excuse to trade assignments. A bad knee. A headache. Something urgent downstairs. At the time, I thought he was simply lazy. Looking back, I'm not so sure. The strange part is that nobody ever described an actual problem. No one claimed they saw ghosts. Nobody told dramatic horror stories. Instead, they acted like people discussing an unpleasant memory they didn't want to revisit. That silence bothered me more than any supernatural tale could have. Because silence usually means there's something worth hiding. As the months passed, I found myself paying more attention to room 214. Every night I walked by it. Every night the lock gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Every night the hallway felt just a little different there. Not colder, not darker, just wrong in a way that's difficult to describe. Like a sentence with a missing word. Like a picture hanging slightly crooked. A small detail that your brain keeps returning to no matter how hard you try to ignore it. The mystery slowly worked its way under my skin. And then, one night, while cleaning nearby classrooms, I heard something from the other side of that locked door. Something that should not have been there at all. I could swear someone or something was inside. The first time it happened, I was cleaning a classroom directly across from room 214. It was a little after 11 at night. The building was empty. I'd already checked every floor, locked every exterior entrance, and watched the last teacher leave nearly 2 hours earlier. As far as I knew, I was alone. I was wiping down desks when I heard it. A scrape. Soft. Faint. The sound of something heavy dragging across a floor. I stopped moving immediately. The noise came again. S-C-R-R-R-R-up. Not loud. Just enough to reach me through the open classroom doorway. At first, I assumed it was another janitor. Maybe someone moving a desk somewhere down the hall. But then I remembered I was the only custodian scheduled that night. The hallway outside was completely empty. I stepped into the corridor and listened. Silence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. For several seconds, I stood there feeling slightly ridiculous. Then the sound returned. This time I knew exactly where it came from. Room 214. The locked classroom. The scrape lasted only a moment before stopping abruptly. My stomach tightened. Not because I thought anything supernatural was happening, because someone could have been inside. A student, a trespasser, someone who had somehow gotten access to a room that was supposedly never opened. I walked toward the door. Each step seemed louder than it should have. The hallway stretched around me in complete silence. When I reached the room, I pressed my ear against the wood. At first, I heard nothing. Then came a whisper, a faint murmur, so quiet I couldn't make out the words. It sounded distant, like someone speaking from the far end of a large room. The voice continued for only a few seconds before fading away. I froze. Every rational explanation immediately collided with one problem. The room was locked. It had been locked all day. I knew because I'd walked past it repeatedly. Yet there was no question I had heard something. I knocked firmly. No response. I knocked again. Nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sounds themselves. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I crouched and looked through the keyhole. The view inside was limited. Darkness filled most of my vision. Only a narrow slice of the room was visible. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement. Vast. A shadow crossing the gap. My heart nearly stopped. Something had passed directly through my line of sight. I jerked backward. For a moment, I simply stared at the door. Every hair on my arm stood upright. I leaned forward again and looked through the keyhole. Nothing. No movement. No figures. No furniture shifting. Just darkness. I remained there for nearly a minute. Waiting. Watching. Trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Then I saw it again. Not clearly. Just enough to register motion. A shape moving deeper inside the room. Gone before I could focus on it. I stood so quickly, I almost lost my balance. The hallway suddenly felt very empty. Much emptier than it had minutes earlier. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe there was another entrance. Maybe security had forgotten to mention someone working inside. Maybe a maintenance crew was using the room. But none of those theories felt right. If someone were inside, why stay silent? Why not answer the door? Why move around in complete darkness? I tried listening again. This time the whispers returned. Low, unintelligible, several voices overlapping. The sound reminded me of people talking in another room during a party. You know conversation is happening, but you can't understand a single word. The noise lasted perhaps 10 seconds, then stopped. Completely. The abrupt silence was somehow worse, because it felt intentional, as though whatever had been making those sounds knew I was standing outside, as though it had decided to stop. I remember glancing down both ends of the hallway. The school seemed perfectly normal. Rows of lockers, classroom doors, bulletin boards filled with student artwork. A place designed for learning and routine. Yet behind one ordinary-looking door, something was happening that made no sense. The contrast unsettled me more than any ghost story ever could. That night I finished my work, but my attention never left room 214. Every trip through the hallway ended with me staring at that lock, wondering, questioning, imagining possibilities that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Because if the room was truly empty, then I hadn't heard anything. And if I had heard something, then the room wasn't empty. Either possibility bothered me. By the time my shift ended, I'd made up my mind. The next night, I wasn't going to stand outside that door guessing. I was going to find out everything I could about room 214 and the history everyone in the school seemed determined to avoid. Everyone avoided that room, and for good reason. The day after hearing the whispers, I started digging. Not officially, of course. Nobody was going to hand me a file labeled Terrifying Secrets of Room 214. So I did what every curious employee does when they have too much time and not enough answers. I listened. Schools are full of records, old paperwork, and people who accidentally reveal things when they think nobody is paying attention. The first clue came from a retired teacher I met during a community event. She had worked at the school for nearly 30 years. When I casually mentioned room 214, her expression changed immediately. Not fear, recognition, like I had spoken the name of someone she hadn't thought about in a long time. After a few moments, she quietly asked if the room was still sealed. Sealed, not locked. Sealed. That choice of words stuck with me. When I pressed for details, she hesitated before telling me the room had been closed decades earlier after what she called an unfortunate student incident. That was all she would say. No explanation, no specifics, just a vague statement followed by an obvious attempt to change the subject. Naturally, that only made me more determined. Over the next week, I searched through old yearbooks, maintenance records, and archived newsletters stored in dusty cabinets near the administration offices. Most of what I found seemed completely ordinary. School plays, sports championships, fundraisers. Then I started noticing gaps. Entire years where classroom assignments skipped room 214 altogether. Faculty lists that suddenly changed without explanation. References to renovations that never described what was renovated. Little inconsistencies that became difficult to ignore. One evening, while sorting through maintenance files, I found records mentioning 3 former teachers assigned to room 214 during different decades. None of them had remained there for long. One transferred schools unexpectedly. Another accepted early retirement despite being years away from retirement age. The third simply resigned in the middle of a semester. No reasons listed. No notes. Just abrupt departures. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then I found something stranger. A personnel report involving a night janitor from nearly 20 years earlier. The document was incomplete. Several pages were missing, but one sentence remained. Employee failed to report for scheduled shifts and could not be contacted. That alone was alarming. People quit jobs all the time. What bothered me was what happened afterward. The report ended there. No resignation. No termination paperwork. No forwarding address. Nothing. It was as though the man had simply vanished from the school's records. When I asked an older maintenance supervisor about him, he became visibly uncomfortable. After a long pause, he told me the janitor had disappeared. Not quit. Disappeared. His car had been found in the staff parking lot. His keys remained inside the building. But he was never seen again. The supervisor refused to discuss it further. That conversation stayed with me for days. By then, curiosity had become obsession. I needed something concrete, something that explained why an unused classroom generated so much silence. Eventually, I found it. The old blueprints. They were stored inside a metal filing cabinet in the basement archives. Large sheets of yellowing paper covered with faded lines and handwritten notes. Most of the building matched the modern layout exactly. Classrooms, offices, storage spaces, utility corridors. Then I reached the section containing room 214. At first glance, everything appeared normal. But the longer I studied the plans, the stranger they became. Behind the classroom were areas that shouldn't have existed. Narrow spaces hidden between walls. Small passages with no marked entrances. Sections of the floor plan that connected to nothing. Some were crossed out with red ink. Others appeared intentionally erased. One hallway simply stopped in the middle of the blueprint, as though part of the drawing had been removed. I checked newer versions. Those spaces were gone completely. Officially, they no longer existed. Yet the original plans clearly showed they had been built. I stared at those drawings for nearly an hour. The realization slowly settled over me. Room 214 wasn't just an abandoned classroom. It sat at the center of something deliberately concealed. Not forgotten. Hidden. Someone had spent years making sure questions weren't asked. Records disappeared. Stories faded. People avoided discussing it. Even the building itself seemed designed to keep secrets. The more I learned, the less comfortable I felt. But by then, turning back wasn't an option. Because every answer created two new questions. And every question led back to that door. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the school windows and the familiar quiet of night settled over the building, I found myself staring once again at room 214. This time, caution was losing ground to curiosity. And curiosity was about to make a very bad decision. It started responding, like it knew I was there. That's the part that still bothers me the most. Not the whispers, not the missing records, not even the possibility that something impossible existed behind room 214. What unsettled me was the growing feeling that whatever was inside had become aware of me. Before I began digging into the room's history, the strange incidents felt random. Afterward, they felt personal. The first clear sign came 3 nights after finding the blueprints. I was mopping the second-floor hallway shortly after midnight when a loud metallic clack echoed behind me. I turned immediately. The sound had come from room 214, more specifically from the handle. I watched it move. The handle twisted downward, slowly, deliberately, then snapped back into place. The hallway was completely still. No open windows, no draft, no reason for the mechanism to move on its own. I stood there staring for several seconds. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes your brain chooses humor over panic. Great, I muttered. Now the haunted door wants attention. The joke didn't make me feel better, especially when the handle moved again. This time I didn't laugh. I backed away. The rattling continued for nearly 10 seconds, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence afterward felt enormous, like the building itself was waiting for my reaction. Over the following week, the activity increased. Most of it happened when I worked near the room. If I spent hours elsewhere in the school, nothing occurred. The moment I entered that hallway, strange sounds would begin. Soft footsteps, scraping furniture, whispers. The noises always remained, just vague enough to prevent certainty. Just enough ambiguity for doubt to survive. Then came the voices. At first, they sounded like distant children talking. That wasn't unusual in itself. Schools have a way of preserving memories in your imagination. Sometimes I'd hear faint laughter and assume it was coming from outside. Sometimes I'd mistake plumbing noises for conversation. But one night, while replacing light bulbs nearby, I heard a voice speak clearly through the door. My name. Just my name. Quiet, almost playful. I froze instantly. The hallway was empty. Every classroom around me was dark. Yet I knew what I had heard. A child's voice, soft and unmistakable, calling my name from inside room 214. I spent the next several minutes trying to convince myself it hadn't happened. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was catching up with me. Maybe some distant sound had been distorted by the hallway acoustics. Then the voice spoke again, closer this time, repeating my name, the exact way a student might call to get a teacher's attention. I left the hallway immediately, not running, just walking very quickly while pretending I wasn't terrified. The experience should have sent me straight to administration. Instead, it pushed me deeper into the mystery. I needed evidence, something objective, something that couldn't be explained away. The school had security cameras covering most major hallways. I managed to get permission to review footage after claiming I was investigating possible vandalism. For 2 nights, I focused on the camera facing room 214. The results made no sense. Every camera in the building functioned normally, except that one. Whenever activity occurred near the locked classroom, the footage glitched. Not the entire system, just that specific camera. Frames froze. Static appeared. Sometimes the image disappeared altogether for several minutes. Then everything returned to normal. At first, I blamed faulty equipment, so I requested maintenance. The camera was inspected, repaired, tested, declared fully operational. The following night, it failed again, only while facing room 214. Only during the exact period, I heard whispers from behind the door. I remember sitting in the security office staring at the monitor, watching the image distort into waves of static, waiting for it to recover, and feeling a realization slowly take shape. This wasn't random. The rattling, the voices, the camera failures. Each incident occurred after I started asking questions, after I started researching, after I became interested in the room. The timing felt impossible to ignore. For the first time, I seriously considered that something intelligent might be involved, something capable of reacting, something capable of noticing. That possibility followed me through every shift. By then, I no longer cared whether the explanation was supernatural or not. I just wanted answers. The obvious solution was opening the door. Unfortunately, every attempt failed. Master keys didn't work. Maintenance keys didn't work. Even administration claimed they didn't possess access. Whatever secured room 214 had been designed to remain closed. If I couldn't enter through the door, I'd need another way. And thanks to those old blueprints, I already had a dangerous idea where to start looking. The school enforces its own rules, whether you understand them or not. That realization didn't come from a document or an official policy. It came from the people who worked there. Once I stopped asking direct questions about room 214 and started paying attention to casual conversations, I noticed something strange. Everyone seemed to know certain rules. Nobody explained them. Nobody acknowledged them openly. Yet they followed them anyway. The first example happened in the staff lounge. A substitute teacher was complaining about classroom assignments when she jokingly asked why nobody ever used room 214. The room fell silent. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone outside the conversation to notice. But I noticed. Several employees exchanged brief looks. One older secretary quickly changed the subject. Another muttered something about forgotten lessons. The phrase drew nervous laughter. Nobody elaborated. At the time, I thought it was an inside joke. Later, I realized it was something else. People were warning each other, without admitting they were warning each other. The second clue came from an evening security guard named Warren. He had worked at the school longer than almost anyone. One night, while we walked our usual rounds, I casually mentioned that I was thinking about spending extra time near room 214. Warren stopped walking. His expression immediately hardened. "You don't go there at midnight." That was his entire response. I asked why. He shrugged. "Just don't." The answer irritated me. By then I was tired of vague warnings and half-finished stories. I pushed for details. Warren refused. But before ending the conversation, he quietly added something I never forgot. Some rules exist because somebody learned them the hard way. Then he walked away. The more I listened, the more rules emerged. Never enter alone. That one appeared repeatedly. Nobody explained where the rule came from. Yet former employees referenced it often enough that a pattern became obvious. Whenever room 214 was discussed, the same warning surfaced. Never go by yourself. I asked one retired maintenance worker what would happen if someone ignored that advice. He stared at me for several seconds before replying. "Depends whether they come back." Then he changed the subject. Another rule involved objects. Apparently, nothing was supposed to remain outside the classroom overnight. No carts, no tools, no cleaning supplies, no boxes. At first I assumed this was a standard safety procedure. Then I learned it applied only to room 214. One evening, I deliberately left an empty mop bucket outside the door. I wanted to see whether someone moved it. The next morning, the bucket sat exactly where I'd left it. The problem was what happened to it. Every metal surface had become covered with scratches. Hundreds of them. Thin lines crossing one another in chaotic patterns. The damage looked years old despite appearing overnight. Nobody could explain it. I never repeated the experiment. The final rule concerned time. Midnight. For reasons nobody would fully explain, midnight seemed important. Activity around room 214 increased during that hour. Employees avoided the hallway. Security patrols adjusted routes. Even skeptical staff members unconsciously stayed away. One administrator laughed when I asked about it. Then he said something odd. "Whatever happens after midnight belongs to classroom 13. The statement made no sense. There was no classroom 13. The numbering system skipped directly from 12 to 14. When I pointed that out, his smile vanished. He quickly claimed it was an old joke, but the discomfort in his voice suggested otherwise. Classroom 13. The forgotten lessons. Never enter alone. Avoid midnight. Leave nothing behind. Each rule sounded absurd in isolation. Together, they formed something unsettling. A system, not a superstition, not random rumors. A collection of behaviors developed over decades. Rules only survive that long when breaking them produces consequences. And those consequences clearly frighten people. The deeper I looked, the more convinced I became that room 214 wasn't merely haunted. The room felt governed, as though an invisible set of laws operated around it. Laws that nobody understood completely, but everyone respected. Even those who claimed not to believe. I wish I could tell you that discovering these rules made me more cautious. It should have. Any reasonable person would have backed away. Unfortunately, curiosity had already carried me too far. Every warning only strengthened my determination. Every rule felt like another piece of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Looking back, that's probably what whatever lived behind the door wanted. Because while I was busy collecting stories and studying patterns, something else was happening. The whispers were becoming more frequent. The voices were becoming clearer. And every night, room 214 seemed a little less interested in hiding. The confrontation I'd been moving toward since the beginning was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching fast, and when it finally arrived, it would happen at the exact time everyone had warned me to avoid. I finally saw it, and it was nothing like I expected. The night began with a terrible decision. Naturally, it was my decision. By that point, I'd spent weeks investigating room 214. I'd collected stories, studied records, reviewed security footage, and listened to every warning people were willing to give. What I hadn't done was follow any of those warnings, especially the one about midnight. At 11:55 p.m., I found myself standing at the far end of the second-floor hallway, alone, watching the locked classroom. The corridor was silent. No footsteps. No humming conversations from distant offices. Even the building itself seemed quieter than usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting pale reflections across the polished floor. Everything looked normal, which somehow made the situation worse, because I knew what had happened every other time I'd been near that room. The whispers, the voices, the moving shadows. My brain kept offering logical explanations, while my instincts screamed that logic had already left the building. 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. I actually started feeling embarrassed. I'd spent weeks building this mystery into something enormous. Maybe the stories were exaggerated. Maybe I'd scared myself. Maybe room 214 was just an abandoned classroom surrounded by decades of rumors. Then midnight arrived. The hallway lights flickered. Once, twice, then stabilized. A cold sensation crawled across the back of my neck. Not a drop in temperature. More like the feeling of suddenly realizing someone is standing behind you. I looked around. The corridor remained empty. When I turned back toward room 214, I noticed something impossible. Light was visible beneath the door. A thin strip of pale illumination. The room had been completely dark moments earlier. Now something glowed inside. I approached slowly. Every instinct urged me to leave. Instead, I crouched near the keyhole. The view inside was clearer than before, and what I saw nearly made me fall backward. The classroom wasn't empty. Rows of desks filled the room. That alone should have been impossible. According to school records, every piece of furniture had been removed years ago. Yet there they were. Dozens of desks arranged in neat rows. A teacher's desk near the front. Bookshelves lining the walls. The room looked occupied, as though a class had been using it that very day. I blinked repeatedly. The scene remained unchanged. Then one of the desks moved. Not much, just a few inches. A slow scrape across the floor. Another shifted moments later. Then a third. No visible force touched them. No person stood nearby. The furniture simply rearranged itself. I stared in disbelief. Some distant part of my brain actually tried to calculate whether exhaustion could cause shared hallucinations with security cameras. That was the moment I realized denial had become ridiculous. The room was showing me something impossible. Then I noticed the corner. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a darker patch of darkness near the back wall. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that it wasn't part of the room. It was standing there, motionless, watching, humanoid in shape, roughly human height, but wrong in subtle ways. Its proportions seemed distorted, limbs slightly too long, shoulders unnaturally narrow. The figure remained perfectly still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me. The sensation was overwhelming, like making eye contact with a predator. I remember whispering, "Nope," a completely useless response. But after weeks of investigating a potentially supernatural classroom, my emergency plan apparently consisted of sarcastic commentary. The figure didn't move. The whispers did. They grew louder, far louder than I'd ever heard before. Dozens of voices overlapping one another. Children, adults. Some sounded frightened. Others sounded urgent. The words remained difficult to understand. Fragments emerged from the noise. Single phrases, broken sentences, warnings. At least they sounded like warnings. Don't. Stay. Behind. Listen. The voices tangled together before I could understand the full message. Yet one thing became unmistakably clear. They weren't trying to lure me closer. They were trying desperately to tell me something. The realization sent a chill through me, because it suggested the voices weren't the threat. Something else was. The figure remained motionless in the corner, watching, waiting. The desks continued shifting around the room as though invisible students occupied them. A chair slowly turned toward the door. Then another, until every seat in the classroom appeared aimed directly at me. The effect was horrifying, like an audience silently acknowledging my presence. And that's when I made the smartest decision of the entire night. I decided to leave. Unfortunately, room 214 had apparently decided otherwise. Because the moment I stepped away from the door, something in the hallway changed. And suddenly getting out wasn't going to be nearly as easy as walking away. Every instinct screamed not to, but I did anyway. The moment I turned away from room 214, I should have kept walking. I should have gone downstairs, called security, gone home, done literally anything other than what happened next. Instead, curiosity won again. The whispers behind the door had changed. For weeks they had been distant and fragmented. Now they sounded urgent, desperate, like dozens of people trying to warn me about something approaching from behind. And somehow, that urgency convinced me to stay. I told myself I needed one final piece of evidence, one clear answer, one undeniable proof that would explain everything. The truth is, I was already obsessed. As I stood in the hallway, my flashlight slipped from my belt and landed near the base of the door. The metal casing struck the floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the corridor. I bent to retrieve it, then paused. A memory surfaced immediately. Never leave objects outside the room overnight. One of the rules, one of the many warnings everyone seemed to follow without explanation. For several seconds, I stared at the flashlight. Then I laughed nervously. "Come on," I whispered. It was a flashlight, not some ancient ritual artifact, not a sacred object. A flashlight, the kind of thing maintenance workers lost every week. The rule suddenly felt ridiculous. So I made a decision that still makes me angry when I think about it. I left it there, right in front of room 214, just to prove the stories were nonsense. For nearly 10 seconds, nothing happened. I actually felt relieved. Then the hallway lights went out. Every single one. Instantly. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Not dimness, not flickering, complete blackness, the kind of darkness that feels physical. I froze. The only illumination came from beneath the classroom door. That pale glow remained, strangely brighter than before. The strip of light stretched across the floor like an open invitation. Then the whispers stopped. All of them. Every voice vanished at once. The silence was unbearable. I remember hearing my own heartbeat. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Then something rattled far down the hallway. A lacquer door. Another slammed seconds later. Then another. Bang, bang, bang. The sounds moved closer. Not randomly, sequentially, as though something invisible was traveling through the corridor, opening and slamming lockers one at a time. Approaching my position, I grabbed the flashlight immediately. The moment my hand touched it, the pale light beneath the door disappeared. The hallway remained dark, but now another sound emerged. Footsteps, soft, measured, coming from inside room 214. I backed away slowly. The footsteps continued. One step, then another, crossing the classroom floor, moving toward the door. Every instinct urged me to run. Instead, I found myself staring at the handle, waiting. The footsteps stopped directly on the other side. The handle didn't move. Nothing emerged. Yet I knew something was standing there, listening. The certainty hit me so hard it felt physical. Then I made my second mistake. I looked directly into the shadowed corner visible through the keyhole. One of the warnings I'd heard from a former employee suddenly resurfaced. Never look too long. At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now I did. The figure was still there, except it wasn't standing in the back of the room anymore. It was much closer, close enough that I could make out details. Its shape shifted constantly. Human one moment, distorted the next. The outline refused to stay stable, as if my eyes couldn't properly process what they were seeing. Then it moved, not toward me, toward the keyhole, toward my eye. I jerked backward so violently I nearly fell. At that exact moment, every door in the hallway slammed shut. Simultaneously, the sound exploded through the building. Classroom doors, office doors, storage closets, dozens of impacts striking at once. The noise shook the walls. My pulse surged. Panic finally overpowered curiosity. I ran. The hallway seemed longer than before. The fluorescent lights flashed on and off unpredictably. Each burst of illumination revealed movement at the edges of my vision. Figures standing near lockers, children watching from classroom windows, shapes disappearing whenever darkness returned. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The voices came back. This time they weren't whispering. They echoed through the corridor. Some called my name. Others repeated phrases I couldn't fully understand. The overlapping sounds created a constant wall of noise. The psychological pressure became overwhelming. Every step felt heavier. My thoughts grew fragmented. Part of me wanted to stop. Part of me wanted to turn around. Part of me wanted to walk back to room 214 and open the door. That realization terrified me more than anything else, because the urge didn't feel like my own. Something was influencing me, pulling, persuading, trying to make me return. Control was slipping away. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I genuinely believed I might not leave the school at all. I reached the stairwell and threw myself through the door, desperate to put distance between myself and the classroom. Behind me, the voices suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, because it meant the room had finished reacting, and I was about to discover the consequence of breaking its rules. Some doors are locked for a reason, and curiosity has a price. I survived that night, at least physically. For a while, I convinced myself that meant I'd gotten away with it. I'd broken the rules. I'd investigated the room. I'd looked where I wasn't supposed to look. And somehow I was still alive. The truth took longer to understand. Not every consequence leaves a visible scar. The next evening, I returned to work expecting explanations. I thought security would mention the power fluctuations. I expected reports about malfunctioning doors or electrical failures. Nobody said a word. The school operated as though nothing unusual had happened. Teachers arrived. Students filled classrooms. Administrators discussed budgets and schedules. Life continued normally. That normality felt deeply unsettling, because I knew what I had experienced. I knew the hallway lights hadn't simply failed. I knew every door in the corridor hadn't slammed shut by coincidence. Yet the building seemed determined to pretend otherwise. Room 214 remained locked, silent, unchanged. The only visible difference was me. I found myself avoiding the second floor whenever possible. Not consciously at first. My route simply changed. Tasks that once took me near the room suddenly seemed easier from another direction. When I noticed the behavior, I tried forcing myself to walk past the classroom. The experience never felt normal again. Every trip down that hallway carried a sense of anticipation, a certainty that something was watching. Nothing happened most nights. The door remained closed. The lock remained polished. Yet the feeling persisted. And feelings like that are difficult to ignore once they've settled inside your head. Sleep became another problem. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the classroom. The rows of desks, the turning chairs, the shape standing in the corner. The image replayed endlessly. I started waking up in the middle of the night convinced I had heard whispers. Sometimes I actually got out of bed and checked empty rooms before realizing what I was doing. The paranoia crept into small parts of my life. Reflections held my attention too long. Dark doorways made me uncomfortable. Unexpected noises immediately pulled my thoughts back to room 214. The worst part wasn't fear. It was uncertainty. I couldn't decide whether the experience had changed reality or changed me. Meanwhile, the security cameras continued behaving strangely. Maintenance replaced equipment twice. Technicians inspected wiring. Everything passed inspection. Yet the camera facing room 214 still malfunctioned. Only that camera. Only that hallway. Nobody could explain it. Eventually, people stopped trying. That detail bothered me almost as much as the room itself. The school had spent decades adapting rather than investigating, accepting rather than understanding. And after what happened to me, I finally understood why. Some mysteries fight back. The deeper I dug into personnel records, the clearer that pattern became. The vanished janitor wasn't the only casualty. There were others. Not deaths. Not disappearances. At least not officially. Instead, I found careers ending unexpectedly. Transfers requested without explanation. Early retirements. People abandoning jobs they had held for years. Every trail seemed to lead back to the same hallway. The same classroom. The same locked door. I began wondering how many of them had made the same mistake I did. How many had ignored warnings because curiosity felt stronger than caution. How many had looked through that keyhole searching for answers. And what exactly they had seen. That's the part I want you to remember. Because curiosity sounds harmless. We're taught that curiosity is valuable. It's how people learn, how they discover, how they solve problems. Most of the time that's true, but occasionally curiosity leads somewhere it shouldn't. Occasionally it opens doors that were never meant to be opened. Or worse, it convinces you to stand in front of a locked door and wonder what's on the other side. I spent years believing every mystery had an explanation waiting to be uncovered. Room 214 changed that. Some things don't want to be understood. Some things survive because people stop asking questions. And sometimes the smartest decision isn't finding an answer. It's accepting that one exists and walking away. That's exactly what I decided to do. No more investigations. No more research. No more midnight visits. For the first time since this began, I was finally ready to respect the boundary that everyone else had learned long ago. Unfortunately, the room wasn't quite finished with me yet. After everything that happened, I stayed at the school for 3 more years. They assume I quit immediately. Part of me wanted to, but life is rarely that simple. Bills still needed paying, work still needed doing, the floors still collected dust, the trash still filled up, and every morning students still arrived carrying backpacks and worries of their own. The school remained a school. That was the strange part. For all the fear surrounding room 214, the building never became some haunted ruin. Teachers taught lessons. Kids laughed in hallways. Normal life continued right beside something none of us truly understood. Over time, I learned what everyone else had learned. Respect the boundary. I stopped asking questions. I stopped looking through the keyhole. Whenever my duties brought me near the room, I did my work and kept moving. The door stayed closed, and the uneasy feeling never completely disappeared. What changed was my relationship with it. At first, I viewed the room as a mystery that needed solving. Later, I understood that not every mystery exists for us to solve. Some exist simply to remind us that our understanding has limits. That idea bothered me for a long time. Human beings like answers. We like explanations. We like believing that every strange event can eventually be placed into a neat little box and labeled. Room 214 never fit into any box I could build. Eventually, I stopped trying. Years later, when I finally left that job, I walked the halls one last time before turning in my keys. The building was quiet. The classrooms were empty. The second-floor corridor looked exactly as it had on the night I first noticed the locked door. When I reached room 214, I paused. Just for a moment. I didn't touch the handle. I didn't listen for whispers. I didn't try to see inside. I simply stood there and accepted that whatever truth existed beyond that door belonged to the room, not to me. Then I continued walking. That was the last time I ever saw it. The lesson stayed with me. And that's really why I'm telling this story. Not because I need people to believe me. If someone had told me this story before it happened, I probably would have searched for rational explanations too. What matters isn't whether you believe every detail. What matters is understanding the warning hidden inside it. Curiosity is powerful. Most of humanity's greatest discoveries began with someone asking a question. But curiosity without caution can become something dangerous. It can convince you that every lock exists to be opened. Every secret exists to be exposed. Every warning exists to be challenged. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes a locked door isn't protecting you from ignorance. It's protecting you from knowledge. And there is a difference. The older I get, the more I appreciate that difference. There are places I don't explore, questions I don't pursue, stories I don't chase. Not because I'm afraid of learning, because I've already learned enough. I've learned that the world contains things that don't fit comfortably inside our explanations. Things that remain strange, whether we acknowledge them or not. The smartest response isn't always investigation. Sometimes it's respect. So if you ever work alone in a quiet building late at night, and you find a door that nobody uses, nobody discusses, and nobody seems willing to open, pay attention. Notice how people behave around it. Listen to the warnings they pretend are jokes. Consider the possibility that the rules existed before you arrived for a reason. Then make your choice carefully. Because the unknown doesn't become safe simply because you're curious about it. And because some boundaries are older than the people who enforce them. Most importantly, remember that not every unanswered question needs an answer. Some mysteries survive because they should. Some secrets remain hidden because they must. And some doors stay locked because opening them costs more than anyone realizes. So if you ever find a door that shouldn't open, remember, some lessons are meant to stay forgotten.